And back here, the 2021 budget presented by the President Muhammadu Buhari is themed the budget of economic recovery and resilience. And it is designed to deliver on the government's economic sustainability plan goals, accelerate the pace of Nigeria's economic recovery, promote economic diversification, enhance competitiveness, and ensure social inclusion. The proposed revenue and expenditure for the budget 2021 are 8.43 trillion naira and 13.08 trillion naira each, resulting in about 5 trillion naira fiscal deficit. Let's look at the breakdown in comparison to the 2020 approved budget and the revised budget. Now, capital expenditure in the approved 2020 budget was 2.47 trillion naira. It was revised to 2.69 trillion naira in the 2021 budget. The government is proposing 3.85 trillion naira as capital expenditure, up by 43%. Non-debt recurrent expenditure was 4.49 trillion naira in the approved 2020 budget, 94 trillion naira in the revised budget, and 5.65 trillion naira in the 2021 proposed budget, up 14%. Our debt servicing was put at 2.43 trillion naira in the approved 2020 budget, was later revised to 2.68 trillion naira in 2021 budget. Debt servicing is 3.12 trillion naira, 16% up. Our total revenue in the approved 2020 budget was 8.42 trillion naira, was later revised to 5.84 trillion naira. In 2021 proposed budget, it is pegged at 8.43 trillion naira. Its percentage change is 44%. Our total expenditure in the approved 2020 budget was 10.59 trillion naira, revised to 10.81 trillion naira. Total expenditure in the 2021 budget is 13.03 trillion naira. Other assumptions in the 2021 budget include oil benchmark of $40 per barrel, 1.86 million barrels of oil production, exchange rate of 379 naira to the dollar, and 3% GDP growth rate. All right, joining me now to make sense of these assumptions in the 2021 budget, the Chief Executive Officer of CFG Advisory, Mr. Tilewa Adebajo, joins me now. Good morning, Mr. Adebajo. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Good morning, Chimezie.
Now, this is the highest federal government budget size ever, 13.08 trillion naira. Do you think it's an ambitious budget?
Well, it's not about whether it's an ambitious budget or not. It's a question of what are the realities in terms of being able to implement this budget. You've given us some numbers on the screen just before we started this discussion. And I'd like to summarize some of these numbers for you. We're projecting revenues of 7 trillion. Out of the revenue of 7 trillion, we're projecting 3.1 trillion of that is going to go towards debt service. And we have an expenditure of 13 trillion. So clearly, you can see that if you take 7 trillion out of about 13 trillion, you have about close to 6 trillion naira of deficit that you need to finance. Don't forget that we carried over another 5 trillion of deficit from last year's budget that we still have not financed. So right now you're looking at about close to about 10 trillion or about $11 billion worth of financing that is outstanding for this government. So the issue is not about whether it's the biggest budget, but the fact is that can we sustain this budget? And really, that is where the challenge is. And I think what is important that you have to understand is that the president also mentioned in his budget speech that we have exceeded the limits of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So technically, what the president is telling you is that this budget is illegal in the sense that the Fiscal Responsibility Act says that you mustn't go beyond your deficit financing should not be more than 3% of your GDP. And this budget has exceeded that. So they're going to have to find ways to amend that. But what I think the message we need to get across is the fact that, you know, part of this year, we were using 95% of our revenues to service debt. We have a revenue challenge. And it's not likely that this 7 trillion revenue, we're going to hit that target. So we have a situation whereby our deficit financing and our debt financing has become a challenge, because by the time you implement this budget, our debt profile will hit over 100 billion US dollars. And that is really where the challenge, and the fact is that, can we fund the debt? Are we able to sustain the debt financing? So these are the key challenges that we need to address in terms of looking at this budget.
Right. You talked about the provision for the debt servicing, which of course is expected to go up as much as 3.12 trillion naira in 2021. Now, the federal government planned to borrow about 4.28 trillion naira to fill the deficit. Now, what worries you most here? Because a lot of people feel that if we are to borrow, it looks like we're going to borrow just to pay, to pay salaries.
Yes, what you're saying is that if you take a look at the recurrent side of the budget, recurrent expenditure, by the time there's a lot of breakdown on what the component of recurrent expenditure is, but from that budget you're seeing, you have recurrent expenditure of about 10 trillion naira in there, and you have revenues of only 7 trillion naira. So you're going to be funding your recurrent expenditure with borrowing. And I think that is really what the concern for most people are. And that is beginning to show you red flags. So what we're saying is that our debt levels are becoming unsustainable, and it's something that we have to take a look at. So this is really what this budget is telling us, that we've hit the limits. And like I've said also, if you take a look at the tenets of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the president also recognizes this, that we have a challenge. So not only are we not borrowing, we're not borrowing to fund capital expenditure, which everybody agrees is a sound thing to do. But when you begin to borrow to fund your recurrent expenditure, then it's a red flag. And we need to begin to take a look at some internal structural adjustments within the government and the system itself.
Now, just as you mentioned, the president in his budget presentation, of course, did emphasize that revenue generation remains a major challenge, but the government is determined to tackle the persistent problems with domestic resource mobilization. We've seen some revenue management measures introduced aside from taxation, which include removal of petroleum subsidy, ongoing verification exercise with integrated payroll, and personnel information, and of course implementation of service-based electricity tariffs. How will these measures help government revenue, and are there enough considering the economic challenges we are currently faced with?
Well, first of all, before the COVID pandemic, our economy was in a fragile situation. The COVID pandemic just took this economy beyond the tipping point. You have a situation whereby now we're in a recession and the economy is growing at negative 6.5% per annum. It's not a big sight. We have 50% unemployment and we have over 100 people in poverty. So the challenges are quite significant. So if you look at what we're trying to do with this budget, it's very important that we create more of stimulus to be able to get people back to work and to look at growth. The challenges the government are facing with revenues, taxes are going to be difficult. If your economy is growing at minus 6.5%, this is not the time to be taking a look at taxes, because how many businesses are barely able to survive, if they're surviving at all? So it's important that you provide the support and the stimulus to get these businesses going. So you're going to have significant revenue challenges. All over the world, central banks are loaning money to government to provide stimulus packages to get the economies up and running. So the challenges are quite significant. So you have a situation whereby over the last 4 or 5 years, the policies have not been focused on growth, and the pandemic has just taken it off the tipping point. So revenue is going to be a challenge. The president admits in his budget that maybe we're looking at hitting revenues, maybe 60% of those goals. So are we making even 50% of our revenue? So there's no more room for subsidies, which is very important. And this is the time we need to look at the structural adjustments that we can put our economy on a growth path.
All right. So talking about recurrent expenditure now, we saw that the estimates seem to have continued to soar. So what should we be doing now to reduce recurrent expenditures? Do you think this trend is sustainable?
It's not sustainable. We need to right-size government. And I think it's important that we take a look at this Oronsoye report. We've been talking about it for quite a while, but we haven't really done much about it. The cost structures for most of the state-owned enterprises are high. There's a lot of inefficiencies within the system. So there's a need for right sizing within government itself to be able to control that wastage within the system and do away with a lot of the subsidies. This is not new information. It's something we've been talking about for the last 4 or 5 years. But I guess maybe because now that we have the challenge, maybe necessity can now be the mother of invention.
Now let's look at the capital expenditure is estimated at 3.85 trillion naira. That's 29% of the aggregate expenditure. President Buhari says that will take care of projects completion. How much impact will it make on our infrastructure stock?
Right now, I think the important is because, as you said, whatever revenue projection you have of 7 trillion, you probably only will be able to realize maybe 55 to 60% of that revenue at best, and you're looking to finance the rest of the deficit, both domestic and international. Now, the timing of these funds are going to be quite are the challenges that we need to look at in terms of when funding will be available and when we can implement some of these projects. So prioritization, I think, is very important right now. I think the key projects, the Second Niger Bridge, a lot of the ongoing rehabilitation of roads in the country, and of course the Lagos Ibadan Kano Rail projects. I think it's important to prioritize what projects they can finish. Because right now this administration has only 3 more years to go, and they need to be able to deliver some legacy projects, very important for the legacy of this government going forward.
And the president, of course, stated that supervising ministers will monitor revenue-generating agencies. Do you think there has been enough push by the revenue generation agencies towards ramping up revenue? Are there measures you would suggest for these agencies like the FIRS or customs?
You have to be realistic, Chimeze. Your economy is in a recession, growing at -5 or 6%. So it shows you there's no economic activity, or it's limited or restricted. So how do you want to tax people when the economy is not growing? It's impossible. Importation has slowed, what will impact revenues. Companies are not doing very well. A lot of companies are experiencing losses. The hospitality industry has been decimated. The airline industry is on its knees. So critical sectors of the economy are in trouble. So there's no magic about this. If your economy is at -6%. It's going to be very difficult for you to raise taxes from revenue, from FIRS and customs. In fact, these agencies need to give people a rebate and give them a tax break to be able to create stimulus, if anything else, at this point in time. So this is not the time you ramp up or you try to increase VAT or get all these things done. You need to give people a break. People are hurting out there, and people need break. They need relief. And unemployment is extremely high. So we need to face these issues significantly. We're at critical stages of this economic development.
So how much scope do we have for public-private partnerships, to deliver some of the budget outcomes?
That you have hit the nail on the head. From the numbers we have seen here now, as you very well presented, it is clear that the government does not have money to fund all these projects. So you have the Infrastructure Regulatory Concessioning Commission, you have the Bureau of Public Enterprises. get all these agencies out. You have so many infrastructure assets out there that you can concession. Partner with the public, the private sector, enhance your public sector, private sector, and get the private sector involved in funding some of these deficits for you. It's not everything that government can do. So government should put out a credible plan so that the private sector can get involved. Because from these numbers, you can see that government does not have the money. In financial terms, government is technically now insolvent. Or what you will say in general terms, government is broke. So we need the private sector to come in to carry some of this burden to help us develop Nigeria. And you've hit the nail on the head there. Private sector participation has become critical.
All right, let's look at other key assumptions there. Exchange rate of 379 naira to the dollar. Is this realistic considering the present liquidity pressure in the foreign exchange market that has weakened the naira in recent time?
Well, like I said, my own issue with the naira is not about the exchange rate you are giving. We need to move away from this static exchange rate mechanism we have with multiple windows. And I think as the World Bank and the IMF have said, let us have conversions within exchange rates and let's have a single window. Once we have that, then we can manage our foreign exchange rate better. It's very simple. If oil was trading at $100 a barrel, then maybe our naira should be at 50 naira or 60 naira to 1. If it's trading at 40 naira per barrel, then maybe it goes up to 200. But if you have a static exchange rate mechanism, multiple windows, you create too many distortions. And at the situation we're in right now, we don't need that. So once we get to a single window, we'll manage our foreign exchange in a more open and transparent manner. So for me, the foreign exchange is not an issue. It sorts itself out if you have the right mechanism.
And of course, the government hoped to grow the economy by 3% in 2021. Is that doable with what we have on ground?
It's doable, but if you grow the economy at 3%, you're at 6% deficit now. You'll still be at a minus 3% deficit. So clearly, it's not enough. So, you're coming from minus 6, you grow it by 3%, you're at minus 3. It's a big step forward, 100%, but you need a more holistic and sustainable approach because our population is growing at 3.5%. So you need to be growing this economy minimum at least 5% per annum. And if 6 at the moment and we're minus 3, that means we still have a long way to go. But it's important that we chart a path to recovery. And I think that is really what is more important in terms of the policy. So the budget is here. We need to also look at our trade policy. We need to take a look at our investment policy. We need to take a look at our monetary policy and our fiscal policy. It's the synchronization of these 4 policies between the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, the Finance Minister, Central Bank, and strong leadership and direction from the presidency that get us out of this economic recession.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adebajo, for your time with us on the show. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.